Hello everyone. Welcome once again to the King's Crypt. Today we're going to read some more scary stories from Reddit. Buckle in. It's going to be a scary ride. Seven Rules of Survival in Apartment Number 12 by relative-tourist7974 of Reddit. It was a humid August day, the air thick with the heavy scent of summer. The sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows on the street as I returned home from work. The city was unusually quiet, as if everybody had retreated from the heat. I opened the door to my third-floor apartment in the old residential building where I lived since childhood. The interior was pleasantly cool, thanks to the thick walls effectively keeping the heat outside. I tossed my bag onto the couch and turned on the fan, which began to hum softly, providing relief in the stuffy air. I had barely a moment to sit down and relax when the phone rang. Jerry's name appeared on screen, my childhood friend with whom I hadn't been in contact with for years. I answered instinctively. Hello? I answered uncertainly, wondering what could have prompted him to call right now. Hi, Harry, it's me, Jerry. It's been a long time. There was something unsettling in his voice, something that made my heart beat faster. Hey, Jerry, something wrong? I asked, trying to hide my surprise. This isn't a conversation for the phone. You got time to meet? We agreed to meet at my apartment at 10:45 p.m. That evening, as the sun began to set, I heard a knock at the door. It was Merrick. He looked different from how I remembered, pale, with something disturbing in his movements. I opened the door and let him in. We sat at the table, and I let him speak. Harry, I have to tell you something. Something's been haunting me since the time that it happened, he began, his voice trembling. Do you remember the rules of apartment number 12? I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, and my heart started to race. Merrick's words brought back memories from our childhood, from the first time that I had saw him. We were 14 when it happened. Merrick lived on the lowest level. There was a bricked-up apartment, apartment number 12. It was at the very end of a long corridor with no other apartments nearby. Apartment number 11 was much earlier, closer to the beginning of the corridor, and apartment 13 was on the next floor. There was no apartment above the bricked-up apartment number 12. My parents forbade me from approaching that apartment. I never understood why until that day. That evening, the sky began to darken faster than usual, clouds gathering on the horizon, and there was tension in the air. In the distance, I heard thunder, heralding an approaching storm. I had arranged to spend the night at Jerry's place, who lived 2 floors below. I began to descend the stairs, but at the very bottom I noticed a figure. I descended further. That's when I saw him for the first time, a man with a cigarette. I quickly passed him by. Only after passing him was I able to take a closer look. He was standing on the staircase, his face pale, his eyes deep set, staring at me, or so it seemed. After a moment, he moved toward me. I quickened my pace, but before I realized it, he was already behind me. I feared what he might do, but he passed me, heading towards the door marked number 12. I watched as he approached the bricked-up apartment. Then something happened that I will never forget. The man with the cigarette stopped right in front of the door. Slowly, he reached for the handle. My eyes widened in fear and disbelief. The concrete wall vanished, as if it had never been there. The man casually walked inside and closed the door behind him. A moment later, Jerry saw me through the peephole and invited me in. Now, I didn't immediately tell him what I had witnessed. It wasn't until several minutes later, when we were alone in his room, that I recounted the incident with the mysterious man. He didn't hide his excitement and suggested that we go there the next day, knowing that his parents wouldn't allow us to go anywhere so late. We agreed on 3 p.m. the following day. In the morning, we had breakfast, and I left his apartment, my mind preoccupied with thoughts of the mysterious man with the cigarette and apartment number 12. As the appointed hour approached, my heart began to race. I entered the staircase, and the atmosphere was strangely tense. When I reached the bottom, I saw Jerry waiting for me. Together, we cautiously approached the apartment. Jerry reached for the handle, but all we saw was a concrete wall. The apartment was, in fact, bricked up. Jerry accused me of lying, his excitement turning to anger. Suddenly, he stopped, standing still and staring at something behind me. I immediately turned around, and there he was. The man with the cigarette stood right behind us, straight at the door of apartment number 12. I had never seen him blink. Suddenly, without taking his eyes off the door, he pulled something from his coat. A rolled up piece of paper, which he extended towards us. Hesitantly, I took it from his hand, and almost immediately he turned and walked towards the staircase. Jerry noticed me standing there frozen, and he snatched the paper out of my hand and began to read. Only when Jerry grabbed the paper and started analyzing its contents did I join him. The contents were handwritten, but it was clear that it had been written in a hurry. The letters were uneven, sometimes crooked, as if the writer's hands were trembling. Something to keep up with their thoughts. Some words were barely legible, smudged by the quick movement of the pen. The contents of the notes read as follows. Rules of apartment number 12. Remember, before you decide to explore apartment number 12, think twice. Rule 1. You can only enter the apartment between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. This is the only known way to access the apartment. Rule 2. When the clock strikes 3 a.m., you have 5 minutes to leave the apartment. If you don't, you will notice that where the doors should be, there is only a concrete wall. You will be trapped, and if this happens, follow Rule 3. Rule 3. If you are trapped in apartment number 12, know that your chances of survival are slim. After a moment, you will hear wailing coming from the bedroom, growing louder with each passing second. Hide as quickly as possible and pray that it doesn't find you. You will be able to leave the apartment again at 11 p.m. the following day. Rule 4. Between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. you can move freely around the apartment. However, remember that if you enter any room other than the one with the exit, always close the door behind you after leaving the room. Do not re-enter that room. If you do not follow this rule, you will soon hear a quiet wailing, and the apartment's exit door will slowly begin to close. Run to that exit as fast as possible. There may still be hope. Rule 5. In 1967, a woman with long black hair named Isabella was brutally murdered in the bedroom. She was skinned and cut into pieces. After this incident, no one wanted to live in the apartment, and the building authorities decided to brick it up. However, for reasons unknown to me, the apartment can be accessed during the previously mentioned hours. So remember, if you hear quiet wailing, know that it's Isabella. Don't look at her. Don't turn around. She hates being watched. She hates being judged. Rule 6. Don't scream. Never scream. It will only hasten your painful death. Rule 7. Never turn on light-emitting objects between 11:59 p.m. and 3 a.m. They are drawn to light. After reading the rules, Jerry couldn't hide his excitement. His eyes sparkled, and a smile betrayed his growing adrenaline. "We have to go there," he said firmly. We agreed to go to the apartment at 11 p.m. We told our parents we were spending the night at our friend Ben's place on the second floor to study for an important math exam. When the night came, the clock read 10:55 p.m., and with hearts pounding, we tried to sneak out of Ben's apartment. Unfortunately, our footsteps awoke him. Groggy and confused, he asked where we were going. We told him about apartment number 12 and the rules written on the note. Ben frowned as he read the hastily written list of rules, then burst out laughing, unable to believe our story. But Merrick insisted, urging him to come with us and see for himself. "I don't believe you, but it wouldn't hurt to check," he finally said, visibly intrigued. "I'm going with you." Jerry nodded in agreement. The darkness of the night enveloped us, and excitement and tension grew with every step that brought us closer to that apartment. As we stood in front of the apartment, we made sure the corridor was empty. Then Jerry reached for the door handle. The door opened with a quiet creak, and we held our breath, ready to see what we remembered. A solid concrete wall that seemed to be at the end of our journey. But as the door opened fully, we stood in shock. Instead of the cold concrete wall that we both saw so clearly, we saw an ordinary room. The door was dark, but fully accessible, as if there had never been any obstacle there to begin with. This is impossible," Ben whispered, his confidence dissolving into the air. I stepped closer, hardly believing my own eyes. Jerry stood behind me, just as confused as I was, his hand still resting on the handle of the door. Finally, we snapped out of it, and entered the apartment, closing the door behind us. All three of us took out our flashlights after entering the apartment. The first thing that caught our eye after turning them on was the damage. The walls covered in thick layers of mold. Dark stains spread across the rotting surfaces. In some places, the plaster had completely fallen off, revealing raw brick underneath. And some areas were literally eaten away by moisture. For a moment, I thought I could smell the sickly sweet odor of rotting wood and fungus, which made me nauseous. The windows, barely visible through the semi-darkness, were completely bricked up from the outside. The curtains, which might have once been decorative, were now just shreds, dirty, decayed, and so fragile they could disintegrate at the slightest touch. The furniture in the room was scattered haphazardly. Old armchairs and sofas were caked with dirt, their upholstery consumed by moisture. Trash and shards of glass, which might have once been part of windows or mirrors, were strewn across the floor. Sinister moisture stains hung from the ceiling. In one corner, I noticed the remains of an old broken chandelier, hanging miserably from a single creaking chain. Every breath was a struggle. The air in the apartment was heavy, filled with dust and dampness. Yet in all this decay, one thing was most unsettling. The feeling that despite looking abandoned for decades, the apartment had something in it that made me feel watched. We hesitantly explored what was once a living space until finally, as we approached the door leading to the bedroom, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. Jerry looked at me, his face pale and his eyes filled with fear. I felt that something terrible awaited us behind those doors, something we could not even begin to imagine. The smell of rotting meat hung in the air, making me feel sick, and only intensifying the sense of unease. The door creaked open, and we stood in the doorway. What we saw exceeded our worst nightmares. The bedroom looked like a scene from a macabre film. The walls were covered in bizarre, chaotic drawings made with blood and something that resembled dried shreds of flesh. In the middle of the room stood an old, decayed bed, its mattress torn and soaked with blood, which had dried over time, forming dark, sticky stains. On the bed lay something that resembled old, tattered rags. Only after a moment we realized it was a person. The body was in a state of decomposition, barely held together. It was scarred, and in some places its limbs were cut off. Its eyes, empty and lifeless, seemed to be staring straight at us. Then I realized who I was looking at. I was looking at Isabella. I ran out of the room as fast as I could. The sight of the decaying body made my heart pound wildly, and my stomach churned. I felt an uncontrollable shiver run through my entire body. Jerry reacted second. He turned abruptly and almost lost his balance, running out of the room. His breath was ragged, his eyes wide with fear. Before we reached the front door, I felt I could no longer hold back my nausea. I stopped, doubled over, and vomited on the floor. My body trembled. I also noticed that for some inexplicable reason, the apartment door was open. Moments later, Ben ran out of the bedroom, asking what the hell was that? I didn't listen because I realized something that froze the blood in my veins. Ben hadn't closed the bedroom door behind him. Then I heard it. A faint, almost inaudible wail came from inside the bedroom. The sound was like a moan. Slow, full of suffering. Jerry and Ben lifted their heads and looked towards the opening bedroom door. I wanted to do the same, but I remembered the rules. The fifth rule. At the same moment, my friends turned their gaze towards the bed. The wailing grew louder, turning into a cry of despair, and I felt pure survival instincts take over. I didn't wait a second longer. I ignored everything. I didn't care what Jerry and Ben were doing, or even if they were running after me. I thought of only one thing. Run. I sprang to my feet, leaping over broken furniture and piles of trash. I ran blindly, barely noticing what it was in front of me. My heart pounded like a hammer, and my head throbbed with adrenaline. Every step, every stumble in this abandoned, rotten apartment only spurred me to even greater effort. Suddenly, I noticed the door leading to the corridor slowly starting to close. My heart stopped. I knew that if those doors slammed shut, we would be trapped in this cursed apartment, and the only hope of escape might disappear forever. Jerry ran beside me, his breathing heavy, his movements full of panic. My heart beat in quick, almost terrifying coordination. Just as the door slammed shut with a loud bang, Jerry and I were already in the corridor. We tumbled out of the apartment, falling to the ground, trying to catch our breath. With a mixture of terror and relief, I looked at Jerry. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. Suddenly, a cold shiver ran through me as I realized Ben was still inside. I suddenly collapsed, struggling to stand, but my legs would no longer obey me. I fainted, collapsing onto the cold, dirty corridor floor. I swear, in that moment, I saw him. A man with a cigarette stood at the end of the corridor, smiling at me mockingly. After those events, we decided to remain silent. It was a decision that came hard to us, but we considered it the only possible one. Ben's disappearance was reported, but he was never found. He vanished without a trace, but I still remember. I remember the mocking smile of the man with the cigarette, and that awful moan that haunts me in my nightmares to this day. And though years have passed, I still can't forget what happened to Ben, and I still feel the weight of the fact that he was never found. After Jerry and I finished school, our paths diverged, and I never saw my friend again, until that evening. Do you remember that horrible evening? The night that changed our entire lives? Especially mine when I looked into the bedroom that night, and I saw that... What did you see? I asked, worried. I saw Isabella. Her corpse slowly stood up on what used to be legs, and she let out that moan. I saw her grab Ben by the ankles and slowly drag him into the bedroom. I heard his screams, and then the sound of bones breaking. I know that your nightmare probably ended that day, but mine had only begun. Since then, I hear her at night. I hear her whispers, and they're accompanied by the smell of rotting meat. I was probably the only one who didn't think he was crazy. I was there with him. I saw those things. I heard that awful moan. In 5 minutes, it'll be 11 p.m. I'm going to that apartment. I can't take it anymore. I have to find a way to end this. It dawned on me that I was most likely seeing Jerry for the last time, and I watched as my friend got up from the table and left the apartment. I work the night shift at a graveyard, and a strange man keeps breaking in. By Yangius But Better of Reddit. Yes, I really did work the night shift at a graveyard. I know it's like the quintessential, I would never work that kind of job in the world, but you would be surprised how well they pay. I'm already a night owl, and live close by, so it was a no-brainer to take the job. It was really easy too, once you get past the boredom. What you're supposed to do is patrol the yard back and forth all night, but to be honest with you, I patrolled it once, maybe twice, just sitting in a small gazebo near a pond for the rest of my shift, watching videos on my phone. At the time, however, my boss was really cracking down on us doing our job properly. Apparently there was a boom in grave robbing in the area, so he wanted to make sure we were on the lookout. He installed new cameras, one directly inside the gazebo, so I had a feeling someone snitched. So after that, I just popped one earbud in, opened up a podcast, and mindlessly walked back and forth, pretending to look vigilant. Sometimes I would see things, mainly animals like raccoons or possums, since the nearby forest was full of them. But one night I saw something that would turn me, a graveyard night watchman, into someone who was deathly afraid of the dark. My therapist advised me to tell this story. She said it would allow me to truly acknowledge what happened, to face my fears, and so on. I don't have a lot of family or friends, so the best I got are strangers on the internet. I'll try to get this over with quickly, but thoroughly enough so that I can really relive what happened, and maybe that will shake me loose of whatever grip it has on me. See, I'm a grown-ass man, but I have to leave a lamp on when I sleep. I need to get a fucking grip, and this is apparently the best way to do it. Maybe retelling it will help me uncover necessary details for me to cope properly. And as she would say, see what I fear in the dark so much. I was on night patrol, of course. At this point, I had been working the job for about a year or so. I worked it enough that the process of walking up and down a land of corpses became tedious and dreadfully boring. I was alone that night. Sometimes they have two people on watch, but oftentimes I got to shifts where they left me alone. So all that I had was me, my podcast, and the graveyard. I think it was about 5 hours into my 8-hour shift, so my mind had fully turned to mush from the monotonous walking. Just to paint the picture, there were 2 long gravel paths on each side of the main section of the gravesite. There were also smaller pockets of land dedicated to, I guess you would say, special people. Important politicians, local celebrities, and people who died in tragedies, for example. You could only visit these by going off the gravel paths. It was a pain in the ass, but there was a camera pointed at every spot's entrance, so you had to go into them unless you wanted the boss breathing down the back of your neck. I would walk the gravel paths up and down the rows of gravestones, making sure the dirt was settled and nothing had been vandalized. As I was making my way to the end of the main patch, I could see a figure seemingly kneeling in front of one of the gravestones, their shadow just outside of my flashlight's reach. This isn't an uncommon sight. Sometimes people just sneak in to visit a relative early in the morning during a time of need. I tend to leave these people alone, even though I'm supposed to escort them out. I just don't really think it's up to me to decide when someone has to stop grieving. But I had to at least speak to the person to see if maybe they'll just go if I ask nicely. I walked to the row the person was in and clicked off my flashlight, relying on the moon to light the way for me. I could make out more details as I got closer. It was a man, mid-30s, wearing a beige coat that was so dirty it may as well just been straight up brown. His head was hung low, hands on his knees, and his shaggy black hair obscuring his face. I assumed he was praying, so when I got decently closer to him, I waited for him to finish his prayer before I asked him to get going. When I stopped, he lifted his head up while still keeping his shoulders slouched. Even when he looked at me, his hair dangled in front of his eyes and his cheeks. I only got a glimpse of seemingly disgust or maybe sadness hanging on his lips. Like he was upset I was interrupting him. He returned his head back into its dangling position without a word, so I spoke. "Hey man, I get it," I said. "I always tried to connect to these people. I mean, I've lost a lot of people in my life. Hell, my sister was buried in this graveyard. Can't say I never stumbled over there and cried a bit. There's no shame in it. I just got a job to do." He didn't look at me. He didn't utter a word. So I continued to try and build a bridge between us to maybe help him out of the slump he was literally and figuratively in. "It's real bad, I know. But hey man, it gets better." "Talk to me about it." Still nothing. No problem with me. I don't want to force anything out of anyone that doesn't want to tell me something. I did shift myself a little bit to get a better look at the gravestones. Ardeen Finch, 1912 to 1936. "How'd you know her? Great-grandmother or something?" That was a very nosy thing of me to ask. I know. I felt bad for doing it at the time, but I was really puzzled as to why someone who couldn't be older than 40 was mourning people who died before he was even born. Potentially even before his parents were born. Even if it was a distant relative, who breaks into a graveyard at 4 in the morning to mourn their great-grandmother? Still nothing. "Just wrap it up eventually, alright buddy? No rush, but I do have a job to do. Get home safe." I walked out of the row and down the rest of the gravel path, peeking into his separate patches, and eventually wrapped back around to the other side of the yard. He was gone by the time I reached that row again. I thought that was weird because the entrance to the site was back where I was coming from, so it was strange to me how I missed him somehow leaving. But I was tired and just wanted to get back to the gazebo so I could rest for a few minutes before repeating the same cycle. I was actually kind of thankful for him being there. Made my night at least a little bit less boring. I can't believe I ever felt any positive emotion relating to him. Next night, I was walking the paths again, and he was there again. This time it was a different grave in a different row. The grave itself was kind of off the side of the rest of the yard, so this time I approached him from behind. He was on his knees again, but this time his hands were on the ground and his body lurching forwards. Even from a far distance away, I could see his shoulders rise and fall in a slow shifting movement, like a dog panting after a long walk in the heat. It was so grossly aggressive. I had my flashlight on him this time, so I got a real good look at just how muddy his jacket was. It looked like the dirt was sewed into the fabric of his jacket. I could also get a good look at his blue jeans, also caked in dirt and mud. He wasn't even wearing shoes. His feet bright pink in the spots where it wasn't earthly brown. My first thought this time was that he was actually a grave robber, which soured me a bit because I knew my boss was going to have my head for allowing a grave robber to probably run off with a bunch of goods last night. Wasn't going to hear the end of it. So I tried to amend it early by getting him out of here now. "Hey!" I called out, trying my best to potentially scare him into instantly coming clean. He stayed hunched over in front of the grave. I stomped over, my light shaking with the furious steps causing the man to flash in and out of frame. I stood over him, my light giving me a glimpse at the name on the grave. Sandy Mandor, 1997 to 2018. "Hey man, what the fuck are you doing here?" He snapped his head up at me. His hair was plastered to his face, which had a sheen of wet glow as the light lit it up. His hair split and turned in a way that allowed me to get a good look at one of his eyes. They stared a hole into me, pure rage and anger in them, like a blinking red light intended for warning people to evacuate an area immediately. He was gritting his sickly yellow teeth at me like a snarled animal. I saw his grip on the dirt beneath him tighten up, his knuckles whitening, almost tearing out the grass with his fists. He then spoke to me. "You are not supposed to be here," he spouted, dribbles of spit dangling out as he pronounced his S's. Before I let out a light, "What?" he pushed out a rage-filled rant, as if speaking what caused harm to him. "You walk over their land. Their land. They don't belong here. You trap them, hide them, obscure them." I instinctively took a few steps away from him as the madman had practically screamed at me, ripping out handfuls of dirt and grass to exaggerate his words. Tightening myself up, I reapproached him, trying to portray myself in a more calming way. "Hey man, alright, calm down. I'm not here to hurt you, okay? I'm just doing my job. I just want to know what you're doing out here." His bottom jaw was jutted out, and his eyes danced crazily back and forth, bouncing around its socket like a fly trapped in a cup. Every pant produced a deep, guttural growl from the man. I now thought that this man was either drugged out or mentally disturbed in some way, and this was a manic episode. "You bastard! Let them free of your curse. I will free them, breathe them new life, and when they find out, they will tear you apart. They will spread your organs across the sun." At this point, I felt like there was nothing I could do. I didn't want to hurt this possibly schizophrenic man, and I damn sure didn't want to disturb any of the nearby graves trying to restrain him. I stepped away, slowly, and walked back up the path to the gazebo. I decided to call my superior Benny. He was much more chill than my boss. I knew he was up at this time, because he also worked night shifts with me, so his sleep schedule was all fucked. Thought that he would know what to do, since he's been doing this for years. I've never seen anybody act like this on this site. I've seen people scream and cry, but never cuss me out and speak in the way that this man was speaking. It sounded like randomly assorted gospel shit spouted from a God-fearing man at his wit's end. If there was anyone who knew how to deal with this, it would be Benny. He picked up right away. "Hey, what's up?" "Hey, Benny, how you doing?" "I'm good, man. You?" Yeah, I'm good. Listen, I got a problem. I just need your thoughts on it." "What's the issue?" "There's this dirty guy kneeling by a gravestone. Every time I get close to him, he freaks the fuck out and says that I am, like, holding the bodies hostage or something. He wishes to free them." I acted as if this was the first time that I had seen him. I didn't want Benny to know that I had saw the man yesterday and let him stick around, especially with how he's acting now. Didn't need that potential fine falling on my head. "Well, did you ask him to fuck off?" I asked him what he was doing. "But not to fuck off?" he said in a mocking tone, acting as if calling him out was a waste of time. "I doubt that will work, man. He seems pretty dead set on staying there." "Call the cops." "No, I think he's just out of it right now." "Druggy?" "Maybe, I don't know. But he's not in the best place, and I don't think being shoved into the back of a cop car will help him." "But letting him defile a grave is going to help, right?" "I just want to talk him down, you know? He doesn't need the drama of the cops. I just want him to settle down." Sounds like he's religious of some kind. Those people tend to get really frantic about you and how you treat the bodies. Maybe we're doing something he hates. Just lie to him. He'll fall into it. Say we're just storing the bodies for the Lord or some bullshit. I hated how he didn't take the situation seriously. Maybe that was just the inexperienced speaking me. But I really cared about this man getting out of here without causing any problems. I felt like this was a pretty damn big deal, and I couldn't just bullshit my way through it like Benny was suggesting. But I went to him for advice, so I prepared to trek back up to the man and find a weak point in his ideology to whittle him down. "Alright, Benny, I'll try. Can I stay on the phone with you, though?" I heard a deep cackle from the other side, which I returned with a light chuckle. "See you when I see you, Cassidy." I hung up and walked back down to where the man was. Once again, he was gone. I walked over to the gravestone to see if I could fix any potential damages the man may have caused during his fit. The grass was a bit disturbed, but the grave itself seemed untouched, just the area surrounding it that was torn at, which wasn't that hard to fix. I just tried to press bits of dirt into the small empty patches. Hunched over, I noticed a shimmering glow on the settled dirt that covered the grave. It was like a small splash of water was split onto the grave, soaking into the compacted dirt. It glistened heavily, a polishing glow. I didn't call Benny back. I just continued the rest of my shift. I was a bit shaken up, I can't lie. Just the way the man broke down in front of me. The crazed look in his eyes. That seething hatred that he was shooting at me. The messy clothes, the yellow teeth, these animalistic pants. It all stuck with me that shift. And for the first time in a very long time, I did my rounds a bit fast and stayed in the gazebo a little bit longer. I got the next night off. Benny worked that night. He called and bullshitted me about how he saw the man carrying away a skeleton on top of a boat of possums. I didn't buy it for a second, nor did I find it funny. The night after was the one night that I got where I didn't work by myself, and I was very grateful for it. Me and Benny shared the shift. As I pulled up to the site to replace the afternoon crew, I heard them giggling about a man in the woods. I asked them what they were talking about, and they told me that Benny had spoken about my encounter the other night, adding some unsavory details to it to really ham up the mythos. When he began our shift, I brought it up to him. "You told everyone?" I said, making the anger clear in my voice so that he knew I wasn't a fan of his joke. Just for safety purposes. "You told them he was butt-ass naked and carrying a dead possum." I watched him struggle to contain his laughter before he fully combusts, buckling over in a joy at his own lie circling around back to me. "Come on! It's a little funny," he said after collecting himself. "You're going on first, asshole." Reluctantly began walking down the gravel path first. When we work in pairs, we take turns going around the site so that the other person gets an extra long break. It was by far the best part of working there. Getting those 35 minutes to myself, it reminded me of the time before they added those cameras, and I spent hours by myself at the gazebo. It was the moment of calm I needed as I felt myself get anxious, being myself out in the yard. I don't know why it was really getting to me. Soon, I became a skittish mess, constantly snapping around at the sound of a leaf rustling or an owl hooting. I took out both earbuds, trying to stay as vigilant as possible. When I passed over the areas the man was previously at, I purposely looked away. I'd rather Benny find him than me. While at the gazebo, my moment of silence was interrupted by the buzzing of a walkie-talkie. I picked it up, and listening in, I heard Benny's voice cackle through. "Hey man, I fucking saw him." "Oh, was he closed this time?" I said, assuming Benny was fucking with me again. "No man, this isn't a bit, honest." I still didn't buy it. I don't know if it was because I didn't trust Benny, or if it was because I just didn't want to face the possibility that the man was there for a third time. "What are you talking about?" I said. It was all my mind could come up with after a few seconds of panicked thinking. "I was going by that patch of land dedicated to St. Momery victims, right?" St. Momery was a church that had a shooting only a few years back. I took a deep breath with caution and fear of having it in a chokehold. I whispered, "Was he there?" "Motherfucker was peering at me from the woods." Benny took a moment to catch his breath. It was only then that I noticed he had in some way physically exerted himself. It almost gave me time to take a mental breather, one that was all too short. "Fucker was... I heard like a branch break and turned around and he was right in between the trees staring at me. And he said he was about to start giving them life. That I was impeding on his ceremony. He walked into the forest and I got the fuck out of there." The horror of the man potentially being anywhere gripped me tightly. I suddenly felt fear creep around my shoulders like bugs walking on my skin just beneath my clothes. I constantly felt the feeling that I was being watched, stared at from a distance, just outside of my vision. "Where are you now?" I demanded. About halfway up the right path. I'm coming back to the gazebo, and I'm going to... We're calling the fucking cops, man." I agreed. When he showed up, his normally slick-back hair was spiraling and sprawled. I could see that fear had grabbed him as it had grabbed me. Even more apparent than his fear was the apologetic look that blanketed his face. We both stayed at the gazebo. We couldn't build up the courage of walking down the gravel paths towards the trees. The man could be anywhere in the trees, and we didn't want to risk any chance of running into him again. We told the police where we were and what had been going on. They showed up, they searched everywhere, and they found nothing. Even worse, the cameras somehow caught nothing. None of the cameras were pointed directly at the graveyard. They were just along the paths because they were more for us than they were for intruders. We weren't meant to stop intruders, so with no evidence found, my boss insisted I work my next shift. Another shift that I worked alone. Nobody was willing to cover my shift. Nobody was willing to work with me. I should have quit then and there, but in some ways it was probably better that I was here. I stayed in the gazebo for an extra long time this time. All my coworkers thought I was crazy. They laughed even harder today as I arrived at the site. To them, everyone else, this man had been some stupid urban legend they were spreading around between each other. But to me, he was out there. I stared out into the dark that held the man. Somewhere in that deep, putrid void, those yellow teeth and manic eyes doing God knows what with those graves. I was stunned in fear, completely locked inside my own body. Up to that point in my life, I had never been so afraid, where I was physically unable to move. Hell, I could barely even think. I was almost catatonic, just a shell trapped inside a gazebo, hiding from the monsters that lurk in the dark. Like I'm a fucking kid. I didn't go out there. I couldn't. I was a coward, and I stayed put. My phone buzzed alive, almost shaking me free of my glazed over state. Slowly, like the heater of a car, causing frost to weaken and slide off its windows. I woke back up and reached for my phone. It was my boss. He was saying something to me, but I wasn't listening or responding. I turned myself around, staring off into the pond. The moon reflected against it, in the prettiest way. It took my mind off the job for just a moment. My boss hung up and I was back to being alone. Alone with him. I'm told by the police that they found me at around 4:30, still in the gazebo, dazed off looking at the water, like I was in a trance. Doctors described it as almost like a fugue state. I describe it as cowardice. The first thing I remember was the chief of police speaking to me in the gazebo. "Cassidy," he said, shaking my shoulders as if I was physically shake off my nerves. I didn't really get what the man scared me so badly about. And I guess that's what writing this down was supposed to help me understand. But I still don't get why I froze up so badly. "Yes, sir," I shuddered awake and responded. "You all right?" "No, sir, not really." He sat at the other side of the table. "I see that, son. Well, your boss got in contact with us, and we're very glad he did." I was very confused. What could cause my boss to make a random 911 phone call? Why did he call you guys?" I asked. "He was worried about you, son. Said you were speaking incoherently. A lot of people were worried about you, with all that talk about a man in the forest." I felt anger boil up inside me, the first extreme emotion I had felt in hours. Hot, rushing lava melting my chilled interior. "We found him," he finished. That anger swirled and whirlpooled inside my body, swaying and mixing with new emotions until it created an unrecognizable concoction of joy, fear, satisfaction, confusion, and many other things. That cocktail of emotions made me weak. The chief saw the distress I was going through, so he continued without me responding to his remarks. "Your boss sent us here for a wellness checkup on you, and we just so happened to stumble across a man walking around a gravesite, mumbling to himself about resurrection. He was covered head to toe in dirt, carrying a small shovel like one you'd find in a little kid's sandbox. He became violent when we approached him. We took him away, scanned the area for damages, and for you." Emerging from the sludge of emotion that was powerful, potent flavor. Curiosity. Curiosity driven by fear. What did I allow that man to do while I was out of action? So I asked the chief. The boys took a look and called me. What they found... The chief paused and held his hand up to his mouth as if speaking the next words would be the equivalent of vomit. There was multiple graves that were upturned, disturbed. We found multiple traces of human semen around the graves. That weakened feeling intensified as I felt the need to throw up. My whole body felt off like someone had taken out and replaced all of my organs, only for my body to reject them. I held my hand in my mouth as I violently gagged in the thought of this man pleasuring himself at these grave sites, defiling the last remnants of beloved family members and friends. When I collected myself, I noticed that the chief gave me a look that insinuated he wasn't done giving me details. His eyes squinted so hard you would think he was witnessing the act, as he described it right in front of me. All affected graves were female, but to be honest, we don't know just how many graves he acted on. I'm sorry, son, it isn't your fault. He has more than one thing to say, however. I could see it in his eyes, that there was something hanging on the tip of his tongue, wiggling and writhing around like fish, bumping and piercing his lips until it burst free. He didn't stop with just the surfaces of the graves. There was one grave over by the graves dedicated to those who died in the St. Mamory shooting. My body was sapped of all life. I felt my chest grow heavy, A slab of pure concrete slammed across my lungs and heart, acting off of pure horror. I sprinted out of the gazebo. I could feel the blood surging to fill up my legs. After being inactive for hours, brute forcing their way through my arteries to propel myself down the gravel path as fast as they could. I could see a few cruisers pulled up and down the paths. I could feel tears well up in my eyes alongside vomit in my throat. My head suffered a piercing sting. The information I had just received was so unbelievable to me, I think my brain was punishing my body itself for believing it for a second. Yet there I was running. I arrived at the section of land dedicated to those lost in the St. Memory shooting. In the center was a casket grave that had all the dirt brushed off the top of it and the lid removed. I'd been told by police that I fought off multiple officers who tried to stop me from entering the scene. I didn't remember that, however. All I remembered was walking past that police tape and feeling the world slowing down, like some sick taunt, like it wanted me to feel every millisecond that just passed, so I could suffer a little bit more. I looked over the top of the grave. I saw my little sister's decomposing body. It was thoroughly defiled by him, disturbed by him, and preventable by me. He did this, all while I sat in the gazebo, like a fucking coward. Again, I didn't remember much from this time, but I have been told that I was completely incomprehensible. I threw up, cried, shouted, fought, and I had to be physically removed from the scene by multiple officers, dragged kicking and screaming like a fucking child. That's what haunts me in the dark. It was all my fault.